We must be capable to respond to attacks by force, but also by solidarity. This solidarity, we must show it all efficiency. We are a free people who give in to no pressure, who is not afraid, because we carry an ideal which is bigger than us.
Islamic fundamentalism is the cancer of Islam. This is the reason why we have to eradicate the cancerous cells, because if we do not eradicate them, the great danger is the metastasize. When you get a cancer, you are expected to avoid risky behavior. Well, this is a risky behavior in France that might multiply metastasize.
We are all united. We are all together in the face of this barbarism. We are all affected, terrified, sad, and at the same time we condemn these acts. We also say do not confuse Muslims with these barbarians. The Islam of France is rooted in the values of the Republic. It respects human life.
We believe that sanctities need to be respected. And unless we learn to respect one another, it will be very difficult in a world of different views and different cultures and civilizations. We won't be able to engage in a serious dialogue if we start disrespecting each other's values and sanctities. And I think we would have a much safer, much more prudent world if we were to engage in serious dialogue, serious debate about our differences.
We strongly condemn the latest publication of the French newspaper Charlie Hebdo, which has offensive cartoons of Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, and the way the Israeli newspapers tackled the news with the blessing of the American Foreign Ministry is clear evidence that there's a plan led by the Zionist lobby in the world to target the Muslims, their culture, and their coexistence in the Western countries.
Well, much of the world is now familiar with the terrorist attacks in Paris, which left 17 people dead. But aside from the global condemnation and the outpouring of grief, the attacks have also raised questions about Western foreign policy in the Middle East, the growing Islamophobia in Europe, and the possible political ramifications. To discuss this further, let's turn to our guests for this evening. In the studio, I'm joined by Dr. Ridwan Rizk. He's a political analyst. Dr. Rizk, welcome back to the show.
Thank you.
And in London, we cross over to Richard Millett. He's a London-based journalist. He's joining us there from our bureau. Gentlemen, a warm welcome to both of you. Ridwan, I'd like to begin with you. Let's go back to last Wednesday when that Parisian satirical magazine Charlie Hebdo was attacked, followed shortly by the attack on a kosher supermarket. Is this a one-off or a sign of things to come?
No, that was there were so many signs before. About months ago, you know, we have to remember Sydney attack and then London attack, and then we have this kind of major attack, which we call it the 9/11 of Europe, which is, you know,
we've had a few of those. We've had one in London. We've had one in Madrid.
Exactly. So this is our, you know, firing back at the countries who formed these kind of organizations, and they helped them. They gave them shelters all the way since decades. It's not something new. They know them. They have dealt with them. They have used them. And now they are trying to contain these monsters. We know, created by the West and especially by Britain itself. It has a long history back into forming this kind of understanding or these radical movements. Well, we are talking about since the Wahhabism, which is, you know, this is the main school of ideology of this radical Islam. And we are going to mention names about the, you know, British agents who were involved in forming and helping such organizations in the Arab world, and especially Saudi Arabia.
Okay, so I'm straight. So that we're clear here. Are you suggesting that Western foreign policy, especially when it comes to the Middle East, actually justifies attacks of the sort that we saw in Paris?
No,
last
I'm not talking
week?
About policies, about facts and direct involvement in forming such organizations. No, it's not a policy. Policy, it's something that it could be wrong movement or wrong strategic policies in the region. That well, this is also how we have to mention that. But no, I'm accusing the West and especially Great Britain, the direct involvement in creating such organizations. And up till now, that's the Islamic annual summit still held in London, and the headquarters of the Muslim Brotherhood still based in London, and many Islamic, Muslim Brotherhood's leaders, main leaders, still live in London, and they do benefit out of this asylum, which was, private, provided by the British government.
Okay, Richard, I'm sure that you want to disagree with much of that. We do know, however, now that Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula has claimed responsibility for that attack. But given what Dr. Riz is saying, and given the lack of any real investigation into the incident as of yet, should we be considering other possibilities as to who may have been behind the attack?
Well, you can't ever draw conclusions, obviously, until they've had a thorough investigation. But I think we've seen the photographs, we've seen the footage of the two brothers shooting at police. I think it's fairly clear who was responsible for the hold-up in the kosher shop in Paris. You're right. You can never tell, but 100%. But I think the photos and the pictures and the footage and the CCTV point.
But everything you're talking about, Richard, with all the respect there, those are men with ski masks. I mean, it seems that the international media, the general public, has been pretty quick to swallow this narrative coming from French authorities that it was the Koshy brothers who were behind this attack, which was primarily based on the fact that we had this driver's license left behind in one of the getaway cars.
I'm not sure what you're suggesting. If there's some sort of major conspiracy theory here,
yeah, that's exactly what I am suggesting, actually.
Well, we've heard this before. I mean, I guess it's on the scale of who did 9/11 in New York as well, who was responsible for 9/11. I mean, you could question this. I'm not sure it gets anywhere apart from the fact that the evidence. If you look at the evidence, it looks pretty obvious who carried this out. I don't think that there's any argument unless your own investigative office or other journalists can actually bring something to the table that disproves this. The problem is that they weren't caught alive, so you can't put them on trial and convict them on the evidence. There was a shootout. This is what happens in a shootout. But unless you can produce any alternative evidence, I think it looks to the world pretty conclusive who carried this out.
Okay, let's look at some of the evidence there, Ridwan. We have these Paris shooters. They were radicalized in France. They traveled to Syria. They returned to Europe. They were arrested by security services on terrorism-related charges. They were under surveillance by French and Western intelligence agencies. How did people like that manage to carry out an attack in the heart of Europe?
One of the Kouachi's brothers was very much linked to the French intelligence service. This is first. Second, that I would like to comment on the footage, which is my colleague is referring to. What a coincidence that to see many individuals stationed on the rooftops of the surrounding buildings with cameras ready to take shots from all angles. And we could hear the recording of one of the voices of the attackers, one of the what's supposed to be Kouachi brothers. We have seen two masked persons. We don't know who they are, and so coincidence. And they want us to swallow this story that they have left a driving license behind them. This is very unusual for such a professional mission, let's say, to drop their driving license behind and to reveal their real identity behind. And on top of that, the questions remains. After they were, surrounded in this print house in South, 15 kilometers away from Paris, and the police shouldn't kill them. Why everybody was in that print house was killed? So to eliminate any kind of evidence and investigations that might lead to the truth. It's something that's the same thing that happened in New York. And one major fact happened that the general prosecutor committed suicide 2 days later after taking the case. Why? And they still want us to buy this story that this prosecutor was committed suicide, investigations such a strong and important case to the safety and dignity of the French nation.
Richard, there certainly are a lot of questions surrounding the incident, but let's look at the former Assistant Secretary of Treasury for Economic Policy and the editor of the Wall Street Journal, Dr. Paul Roberts. He posted a comment on his blog, and I'm quoting here. He said, "The uproar over the cartoonist's deaths has the appearance of an orchestration. Whether or not it is a false flag operation, the shootings are being used for a wider purpose or purposes." What do you think is the purpose behind the Paris attack?
The purpose behind the Paris attack was because these are extremists. They don't need a reason to do what they did. They are fanatics. They are terrorists. They are brainwashed by an extremist ideology. They don't need to do what they did, but to have an excuse is handy. It's easy. It's good for them to have an excuse. So then we have these discussions about why they did this. You can't really. There's nothing that can justify this. We can't really discuss why they did this or how this occurred is a obvious discussion. But why these are people who wanted to kill Jews. They wanted to seek revenge against the cartoonists. There's nothing to justify what they did. No one in a reasonable mind would do what they did. They can't be supported. They can't be justified. These were sick individuals who've been brainwashed by people who've got hold of them. There's no justification for killing Jews just because they were Jews. There's no justification for killing people for drawing cartoons that they're offended by. Yes, they can be very offended by them, but to kill someone, there's no reason, there's no justification. You can't really say, why did they do this? It's an excuse that people are using as to why they did it, and everyone else is now being brainwashed. Oh, they did it because of the offence. Oh, the Jews. Why were the Jews killed? What did the Jews do in that case? The Jews never drew a cartoon. They were just out shopping to buy food for their holiest day of the week. So it doesn't make sense. You can't say, why did they do it? They were Jewish people. Were they to be executed solely because they were Jewish?
Mr. Richard, I would like to comment on that, that the 82% of the victims of those radicalists are Muslims. They're not Jews at all. Second, that's why, how can you justify that the stand of the British government when they did have Abu Qatada was living there, was on the most fundamentalist leader in those Islamic groups. Also, Mr. Bakri Fisto, now who's laying in jail, hold a British nationality, and now he's in jail in Lebanon. The other day was a sheikh just preaching and justifying the killing of those two criminals in Paris. And he was encouraging every other Muslim to do the same. So, and he is based in London. Why the British government allowing such criminals to preach and to graduate criminals and those terrorists inside in the heart of Europe? How can they provide all these facilities for such people who do encourage this kind of behavior against the humanity? It's not against Jew. So this kind of Islam was created by like, let's say, some countries who wanted to use this Islam, and they want to use it in a way, because after 9/11 that we saw that after 9/11 Iraq was invaded and millions of people were killed after that. Now what's the West is preparing for the region? Are they preparing an invasion to Syria to use this as justifications to oust or to destroy more Mr. Bashar Assad? How can they do that? If the Western governments will not just admit that they were wrong and Mr. Bashar Assad was right, and he is been saying this for 4 years, that he is leading a war against terrorism, and the Western countries insisted on blaming him for forming what's so-called ISIS. Well, Mr. Kawashi was in jail. Why was he released? If they must be kept in jail. Now the French government had him and they released him, and now they knew a lot. They were aware that he was traveling to Iraq, to Afghanistan, and to Syria. He was just forming and just encouraging many fighters, recruiting fighters from all over Europe to go and fight with ISIS.
Okay,
and
let me stop you right there, Ridwan, because Richard, that argument that Western governments had been warned repeatedly that their foreign policy in the Middle East would backfire and eventually lead to incidents like this.
Well, these incidents, these occurred well before, I mean, it's a chicken and egg. These things happened, these attacks, what would you blame 9/11 on? These wars that took place against Saddam Hussein in Iraq and what happened in Afghanistan, these were all preceded by 9/11. So what caused 9/11? You could go back to the formation, for example, of the Muslim Brotherhood in 1928, 1929. This idea of political Islamism, which has taken Islam and used it for their own political means, for their own political objectives. And this arguably has caused what is happening around the world, these brainwashing of, as we've now seen, young children by ISIS to commit terrible atrocities in the name, as they say, in the name of Islam. But it's an ideology. It's not the religious aspect of Islam. It's the extreme ideological aspect of it, which is now arguably causing Jews to be targeted in a shop in France. Now, they were targeted specifically because they were Jewish. They could have gone to any other shop in Paris, but they went to a kosher, a Jewish shop. There was the Toulouse massacre of 4 Jewish people in 2012. There was Ilan Haloumi, who was kidnapped and tortured to death in 2006. All those 3 incidences taking place in France. We see that Hamas charter, for example, we're talking about going to the Middle East. The Hamas charter calls for the murder of Jewish people. It doesn't speak about killing Israelis. It speaks about killing Jewish people. We see Hassan Nasrallah in Lebanon talking about if all the Jews around the world congregated in Israel, it would save Hezbollah the time of killing them. So this is an ideology aimed at Jews, aimed at what they can see Muslims who don't see their way of thinking. And the West has tried to stop it. The West has been too slow. The West, I agree with the doctor, has been far too lenient on hate preachers who have been able to radicalize their followers in London.
Yeah, but I think what the doctor is saying there, Richard, is not that the West has been lenient, but that the West has actually been the driving force. Its foreign policy has actually been the driving force behind these movements.
Exactly. So,
but I disagree.
On top of that, if that, Mr. Richard trying to just to pinpoint on killing Jews as if the attack was pointing or directing at the Jews. This is something that we have to just to compare, Mr. Richard. If Hezbollah is fighting those ISIS in Lebanon and Syria, why do you still consider that Hezbollah a terrorist organization? And yet most of the European countries and the Western countries still dealing with ISIS, still dealing with the Nusra Front, and your government is the best allies of the source of this kind of ideology, which is Saudi Arabia. If do you care much about your country or the Western countries, which is I do. We don't believe in killing. This is massacres. They are considered in our eyes. They are the most brutal criminals that the world can face. Why do you still hold this strong relations with the countries who are funding and providing all the shelters for those terrorist groups. And you're still ignoring on dealing with the government, and I'm talking about the President Bashar Assad and the Syrian country, who has suffered a lot on fighting the same groups, those terrorist groups. Well, isn't the time that for the Western countries to reconsider their position from just going and negotiate, having a serious negotiation with the Syrian government, how to cooperate and back up the Syrian government, who confronted those groups, who stopped those groups from invading the whole Arab world? And if they did so, achieve any victory in Syria, they would have by now maybe fighting in the streets of Paris and London.
Richard, I see you shaking your head there. Your response to that?
Well, Hezbollah is a terrorist group. They have targeted civilians.
With all the respect, Richard, Hezbollah's terror is classified as a terrorist group by certain Western governments, but it certainly isn't so in this part of the world.
No, not maybe not in Lebanon, but it's certainly targeted innocent civilians around the world, and it's under investigation for carrying out atrocities in Lebanon as well. And going back to Syria, there is no justifiable support for the president of Syria, who started killing his own people in massive numbers, which then caused the uprising against Assad. And then, unfortunately, yes, that was joined by the likes of ISIS. No one in the West, as you suggested, is doing a deal.
May I stop you here, Richard? May I stop you here just asking a question? How did the French government reacted to those two criminals? And they were French, born in France, and they do carry a French nationality. Why did they kill them then? If you are blaming the Syrian government on killing his own people, how do you react to a terrorist when he holds a gun and killing everybody in the street? How did the French government deal with those two terrorists who are fully French?
Well, I mean, they should have spotted them earlier, and there was obviously some sort of lack of supervision of them.
But I mean, they were surrounded in a building and they killed them. Couldn't they wait and hold for at least 24 hours for them to give up or to surrender to the authority, and then they can be trialed and then sent to jail? Why did they kill them? Why did they shoot them? Why didn't they wait on the spot?
I think, Richard, the point here also is, Richard, that as much as the French government has been confronting terrorism, so has the government in Damascus.
No, the government in Damascus has been killing its own people in tens of thousands. I mean, you go back, forget that you forget there was the Arab Spring. There was supposed to be a peaceful uprising by the Arab peoples against their governments, and this has happened, as we saw, in Egypt, and we saw this happening in Syria, and there were massive crackdowns, and Assad executed his own people.
Why don't you call it that saving his own people and defending and taking responsibility of their own people, of his own people, Mr. Richard? What about if you see in the streets of London 83 different nationalities are carrying guns and killing British in British cities? How would the government of Britain react to those groups? Would you like to deal with them democratically in the understanding of democracy? And would you give them the free hand to go around and move around freely and killing everybody in their way? Didn't we see some crimes in the streets of London by two radicalists who slaughtered this policeman in the middle of the street?
You're contradicting yourself. First of all, you're saying they should have arrested the Kouachi brothers and not killed them, and now you're justifying Assad killing the people. So maybe Assad should have arrested those people he wasn't happy with, based on what you were saying previously, put them on trial, instead of just executing everyone without giving them a beat.
We are talking here about armies of foreigners, Mr. Richard. We are not talking about Syrian people. We are talking about Afghans. We are talking about Chechens. We are talking about Pakistanis. We are talking about 83 different nationalities recruited from all over the world. and they came to Syria to liberate the Syrian people. How can any government accept that? It is an invasion of terrorism against the Syrian people. And how would the government react to this? Just pack and leave, and just leave 24 million people in the hands of these brutal organizations who slaughtered the Christians, the Yazidis, and all different minorities in Iraq, Syria, and now they are directly threatening Lebanon? Here is the contradiction.
Well, that's the one. It's certainly an interesting interpretation of what's happening in Syria, considering that Assad has used chemical weapons on a number of occasions against his own people for a start, let alone the mass executions of his own people. And then, unfortunately, because of the anarchy that was happening in Syria, then unfortunately they were joined by the opposition were joined by the likes of Al Qaeda.
Are we talking about the chemical weapons? You are talking about the mass destruction weapons, similar to the one that who used as an excuse to invade Iraq, and it happens to be lies after that.
Well, we've seen that there were chemical weapons used by. I think that it's even Russia stepped in to say, look, this has got to stop.
What about the evidence that who showed that Turkey was involved in these chemical weapons, attacks, and they handed them over to the terrorist groups, and they have used them in many occasions and many bases and many points?
Okay, gentlemen, we are getting a little bit off topic there, so let me stop you. Richard, I want to go back to the developments in Paris following those attacks. We do have intelligence agencies. For instance, the GCHQ in the UK is now being granted greater powers to expand its surveillance programs, given the fact that this was an attack supposedly against free speech. How is that going to, how worrying of a development is that for a journalist such as yourself?
Well, I think there are calls for that. You're absolutely right. I mean, they've got to discuss that in legislation, and they've got to go through the parliament. It's not necessarily going to take effect, but this is an ongoing debate in this country. Who has the right to see emails, text messages? It's almost like an impossible situation. That, as you probably know, in your own studio, you're sending hundreds of emails and messages a day. It's going to be a colossal idea that you can monitor what's going on. But this is going to be an attempt, and there is a debate whether it's actually worth sacrificing some of the freedoms to remain safe in your own city. And this is a debate that is going on at this moment in time, and it has been going on since the bus
Richard, going back to that discussion that you were having with Dr. Rizé earlier, I mean, instead of creating this George Orwell-like surveillance state, wouldn't it be wiser for the West to rethink its foreign policy concerning the Middle East? For instance, to stop collaborating with militant groups that are operating in Syria, where a lot of these Western nationals end up going to fight?
Well, they're bombing ISIS at the moment. You can't say there's any sort of collaboration with
yeah, but that's an oversimplification, Richard, isn't it? Because the truth of the matter is that weapons that are given to groups like the FSA and others end up in the hands of IS.
It's more it's more of a training scenario. I don't think they're actually providing any weapons to these people, but there is a problem.
Well, we do know that groups in Syria have been trained, equipped, and supported by Western intelligence agencies. That's not a secret, Richard.
Well, probably more from Saudi Arabia than equipped by America and by Britain and by France. But it's a very, very difficult scenario to be able to know who you're supporting. We had a vote last year in this country to attack President Assad in Syria. But it was voted down. So it's a very, very difficult situation. Many say that they should have gone in, taken out Assad and deposed Assad, and then the opposition could have united, the moderate opposition could have united in Syria. And
Richard, like they did in Libya, like they did in Libya, for example. Dr. Rizé, go ahead, jump in.
Well, I would like to just comment that Mr. Richard, as a journalist, has a great responsibility towards his own country first. I believe that media in Britain should lighten that about the danger of those Islamist centers who are preaching and brainwashing people in England and in Europe, because they are creating the danger of, just producing this kind of ideology and growing into the heart of Europe. Isn't the time that to close down those centers? Isn't the time that to question Saudi Arabia, who are funding those centers, Mr. Richard? It's the time to stand up, protect your country. I'm talking in your favor here. I'm not working against you. I'm trying to explain to you that the main danger is being created in the heart of Europe and still moving freely. And they are benefiting out of this kind of old relations between the British government and most of the Western countries, which is now they have all the freedom to speech and preach, and they can produce more and more terrorists inside the heart of Europe, inside the Arab world, and then they can be transferred to be used to fight like they did fight in Afghanistan. It was used by the Americans against the Soviet. Now they have been used in Libya just to oust Mr. Gaddafi, and now they have been used in Iraq. Now we are seeing what's happening in Iraq.
The list of
so
war
the
zones
list is very long.
The list of war zones, Richard, is endless, unfortunately. According to the BBC, we have over 3,000 extremist militants in Iraq and Syria alone, which are expected to come back to Europe. How much of a danger is that for the European continent?
Well, it's a massive danger, obviously, because the Kouachi brothers, these three terrorists in Paris trained in Syria and Iraq, and they had connections with fighters, and they were convicted of sending fighters over to Syria and Iraq. And the authorities in this country, in Britain, are trying to monitor those who are coming back, and it's an extreme worry that there's an extreme high state of alert in this country, with that exact possibility that you suggested. So no one's being complacent, and let's be grateful that since 2005 we haven't had any terrorist attacks in this country. That's not to say that nothing isn't going to happen, but the authorities are being very alert, and they're exactly what you're saying. It's an extreme worry, and they're trying to monitor. They're trying to stop people going there in the first place, and trying to monitor people coming back
Richard,
from Syria.
The most important here is not to stop them from coming back. It's the most important is to eliminate this ideology. We cannot deal with the consequences. There are people inside in Europe who are preaching and doctoring those, the brainwashing those, let's say whatever they are, and you cannot just keep on producing terrorism. You cannot just keep brainwashing people and then send them to wars. It's about time to reconsider the position of all European governments. They should be responsible for that, and they should deal with it very seriously, because as we know that up till now, the question remains, after 3 months of the coalition started the war on what's so-called ISIS, 40 countries cannot even just destroy this small, what we call small organizations. We know that the coalition in 2003, they demolished the Iraqi army, the entire Iraqi army, in less than 2 weeks. Now in 12 weeks, we're still hearing some Americans from the administration of United States saying that we need 3 years. How can they explain that to the world, that the 40 super countries, or the strongest countries of the world cannot destroy or just contain this kind of organizations? They still hold large territories. They are more than 15 million people laying under their authorities. They are being slaughtered every day. They are being mistreated every day, and the crime is continuing in the front of the world.
Richard?
Well, 2 points. First of all, your idea about trying to eradicate this extremist ideology, it's something that all the countries in the world are going to have to come together, including people of all religious faiths and denominations, to try and get rid of it. It's not just necessarily the problem of the state. It is the problem of the state, Our country, the British government, has extradited some extremist radicals, Abu Hamza, Abu Qatada, and we're also seeing now that they are bombing, as you say, in Syria. But the problem is, just like Hamas, other terrorist groups, they hide amongst civilian populations. It's very, very difficult to bomb ISIS from the air when they are hiding amongst civilian. They're using innocent women and children to.
This is not the case in Iraq, Richard.
Well, it's. I mean, ISIS has got control of major parts of northern Iraq, and this is what they're doing. We're seeing, Iran is fighting in Iraq to try and get ISIS out of Iraq. Maybe force it back into Syria, whether they can then concentrate on it in Syria. But Iran is also finding it very, very difficult.
Question here, Richard, if you want to ask the question here, that the Saudi kingdom, the Saudis are just, we all know this a fact, they are muppets of the Americans. We know that the Qatar has, the largest and the base of the American army in the world, maybe in the Arab world, let's say, or the Middle East. We know that Turkey is member of NATO, and we all know that that this Mr. Erdogan, one of the Muslim Brotherhood leaders in the world, and he is the first. Mr. Erdogan still providing and giving all facilities to ISIS. Why the Americans or the Western countries cannot just put an end or stop this country dealing with ISIS directly, supporting them, funding them, and then they provide all, they're giving them paths into Syria and Iraq. It's about time.
Okay, Richard, there's a lot of talk, of course, that this war against the IS, this war against terrorism, it's not so much a war against terror, but a war against Islam. Now, we know that Muslims make up 6% of Europe's population. What is the future for this marginalized community?
It's not a war against Islam. It's not a war against Muslims. This isn't true. This is a war against, how would one say, Islamism, radical Islam, a twisted version of Islam. This isn't Islam, the religion. This isn't the innocent Muslim people.
Okay, Richard, let me ask you, do you think that ordinary Europeans understand the difference between the two?
No. A lot of them don't. A lot of them do. But yeah, I mean, there is some confusion, unfortunately. And this is why we're seeing innocent Muslims and mosques targeted. And it's terrible that is happening. But you're absolutely, it's an extremely good point that people don't necessarily, people conflate Islam with Islamism, and they conflate Islam with what's being carried out by these, the terrorists claim that they're carrying it out in the name of Islam, and people don't see that. They don't understand it, as you suggest, and people become scared because they're not understanding the situation, and certain radicals take it upon themselves to then attack innocent Muslims or mosques as well. So it's a problem for Muslims in the West. I absolutely agree with you, and it's a case of hoping that everyone stays safe. And as I said halfway through this program, that somehow the security services and all people can help each other in identifying this problem, and maybe helping the authorities identify those people who might be on the verge of carrying out what we saw in Paris.
Richard, how can you help the Europeans to understand Islam? It's just by closing down those Islamic centers who are preaching and just showing this kind of radical Islam. Why are those institutes in all over the world are still open, and they are still free to talk whatever they want to talk, and they are not being stopped at producing terrorism? But I want to talk to you about something like we all know about the incidents in Sydney. But did anyone talk about the Islamic Center who was opened by Saudi Arabia in 1970, and who has, you know, a lot and great role in preaching in producing this kind of Islam, brainwashing Islamists in Sydney, let's say in Australia. Why don't we close down those institutes? Why don't we shut up those voices who are trying to introduce this kind of understanding of Islam? So if this, we don't have to just to go around and teach every single individual Europeans about which is, you know, the version or the you know, the moderate version of Islam. We have to shut up the other people who are trying to introduce their understanding of Islam. But I can be very honest, direct with you, that the Western countries who are benefiting from this kind of Islam, because they have used this Islam many times, and we know, you know, that the Great Britain has a, you know, direct role in forming the Muslim Brotherhood by Mr. Hassan Banna, who was the creator, and that was the starting point at that time. And we know that Britain has a great role in forming those new Wahhabism in 1915, 1916, and after all, they have just took care of this kingdom who just, you know, based on this radical Islam. It's based, the whole country, the whole kingdom is being ruled by this understanding of Islam. I believe that the Western countries should be much more and show direct responsibilities to the world, to the humanity, that this kind of manufacturing, this terrorism must stop. Well, if we want to compare that, they have produced and dealt very strong with the Zionist organization, which is the most radical understanding of, you know, treating the humanity also. Why are the West still, you know, the Western countries still dealing or trying to contain this kind of ideology? This kind of ideology must be eliminated because it's creating great danger to humanity, not to only one country. We are suffering from this radicalist more than Europe, and still the Europeans don't want to admit that.
Okay, gentlemen, I'm afraid that on that note, we have run out of time on this week's edition of the show. I do want to thank both of my guests, Dr. Ridwan Rizeh and Richard Millett in London.
Thanks, Richard.
And thank you for watching. Don't forget, you can catch us again at the same time next week. Goodbye for now.